That's why pushing for trade deals that benefit citizens and not just multinationals or a country's bottom line, but the actual citizens, is the only way we are going to continue to move forward constructively and effectively in an increasingly globalized world. The alternative to trade deals that focus on citizens is no trade deals at all.
Well, that was just this morning in China, where Justin Trudeau wrapped up his trip there today. There have been some mixed reviews here back home, all because he's coming back with no trade talks, no deal at all. Trudeau made no agreement with Chinese officials to start that process. At issue, happy to talk trade, though. Andrew Coyne is in Toronto tonight, Chantal Hébert in Montreal, and joining us for the first time, we won't hold it against him, Jason Markusoff of Maclean's. He's in Calgary tonight. Good to see everybody. I'm going to start with you, Chantal. What do you make of the fact that Trudeau went over there, and there seemed to be an expectation, not clear to me who it was created by, whether it was created by the government or media or other people, about the idea of getting this free trade deal, and he doesn't have it. He's coming back without it. What does that tell us about the government's approach to trade, or maybe more specifically the government's approach to China?
That tells me something about the government's management of expectations, possibly, rather than the management of the relationship with trade. I'll just try to set up a few things that are distinct to this era and this government. I don't think there's ever been a government that has had so many resources on so many trade fronts at the same time. That is pretty unique. We have negotiated free trade agreements, major ones, with the US, with Europe in the past, but we tended to do them one at a time and not play on 2 or 3 fronts at the same time. And I think part of that multiplication accounts for some of the problems. I also think that the negotiation of a trade deal with China is easier said than done politically, in case no one noticed, but the business sector in Canada certainly did. The Liberals are the most likely to strike a deal with China. The Conservatives are not into that. They're very suspicious of that deal, and the NDP isn't either. So it's not that easy a sell if you're going to go down that road. What do you think, Andrew?
Well, it's true that they've got 3 different major sets of negotiations on at the same time, but they don't seem to be making too much headway in any of them. Before this, we had the debacle, I guess you would say, the Trans-Pacific Partnership talks in Vietnam. Not only Australia, but Japan and other countries are quite put out by our performance there. And we've got the talks in NAFTA, which are going steadily nowhere, and lots of blame to be thrown around for that. But what does seem to be the case is part of what makes this government different as well is they've got rather a different conception of what free trade should entail, including all these chapters to do with Indigenous rights or gender rights or climate change, et cetera, which may or may not be a good idea, but it's certainly running into a lot of headwind with these other countries. And the notion that we were going to goad and push China into accepting this seems to me to be more than a little fanciful.
Well, I wondered, Jason, whether this was very wily on the government's part, whether it's some sort of negotiating strategy that I don't yet understand, or whether, as Andrew points out, maybe they're just not really that good at it.
I think there's a bit of negotiating strategy here that hasn't really been discussed. And here's what I mean, because it does sound ridiculous on the face of it. I mean, this is not a very, fully advanced free market economy. I mean, basically asking them to obey, gender rights, Indigenous rights, and environmental rights is sort of like asking a grade 10 student to hand in their undergraduate thesis. What they really have issues with, and what they really need to get into a good trade deal, even to launch a good trade deal, is simple things like patent protection, proper market access, predictability, rule of law. So were Justin Trudeau to say we're not getting all these things, that would really raise the hackles of the Chinese government, which are pretty easy to raise, as we've seen.
Chantal, maybe last word on that.
Yes, I mean, if you thought it was hard to sell, but to negotiate a free trade deal with the United States that has some comparable standards to Canada, imagine what it means to do so with the Chinese, and to do so from a position of, frankly, inferiority. There is a reason why no G7 country has negotiated one yet, and that we would be the first if we go down that road. And it's not just that the others are not interested, but that the obstacles are daunting.
Let's just turn our attention to these by-elections, and by-elections can mean everything or nothing, depending on whether you win them. These are end-of-the-year ones, and they're sort of interesting, not only because of where they're happening, but also in terms of who you might think they're testing. Andrew, the one in Surrey, BC, I mean, you can go wherever you want, but the one in Surrey, BC seems to be the closest race and seems to have the most importance to all the parties. But give me your take. Yeah, it's the only one that you can reasonably expect there's a chance of it being of it changing hands. Yeah. Maybe in Scarborough, Agincourt, but that would be the Liberals would have to be doing awfully poorly in Ontario for that to change hands. Even so, even if a riding doesn't change hands, you can look at how the vote for a party compares to how it did last time, and sometimes you can read tea leaves in that. Of course, we in the media tend to be rather over-invested in the significance of these things. But certainly, if the one in BC, if it goes Liberal, that's certainly a very encouraging sign for the Liberals in BC. They've been sagging in most of the country, except in Quebec and BC. Yeah. If they're able to take that riding from the Conservatives, that would certainly be a feather in their cap. Chantal?
Well, if you look at Andrew Scheer, his first by-election season, lost a seat in Quebec, could lose a seat in BC. If you can't win in BC a seat that you've held or a seat in Quebec that you've had for a decade, you are probably going to have to work really hard at being competitive in the next federal election.
What do you think, Jason, out west?
I mean, and on the west one, Conservatives, Reform, Alliance, they've all held this this Surrey seat. I mean, this hasn't gone Liberal, I think, since the 70s or possibly 60s. And this isn't, say, a bellwether riding for BC or the Lower Mainland. This is more white, more affluent, the White Rock community. This is not a community where, you know, the Trans Mountain Pipeline or Indigenous rights may weigh heavily in. You know, the person who really hopes to get something and has some opportunity, ideally, is the NDP's Jagmeet Singh. This is the first by-elections where he might play, but you know, in fact, getting maybe 17% in one of these ridings may be a victory for him. So
well, yeah, well, let's just talk about him for a minute, because everything that I've read about that by-election, the NDP has been trying to lower expectations, saying, well, you know, this isn't a place where we would normally win. But if the NDP wants to pick up any support, it has to be in British Columbia. And it seems to me that if this is a test for Scheer, it must be a test for Singh as well, Chantal. Yeah.
Well, but I'd look at the Scarborough riding if you want to test for Singh, because not to take it away from the Liberals, but to make some inroads in the cultural communities where the Liberals find a lot of strength in Ontario. I mean, Scarborough is not all that far from where Mr. Singh's base is. Yeah. I understand that they're very different, but if he can't increase the score of the party there, then his zone of influence will come across as fairly limited.
Andrew?
Well, if Andrew Scheer has not exactly set hearts on fire, Jagmeet Singh, I think there's not a lot of evidence of a whole lot of excitement around him. I saw one poll the other day on Best Prime Minister. I think it was at 6%.
I saw that too, yeah.
So he's having trouble getting his name in the news, getting the FaceTime, getting the excitement going. So I would be very surprised if the NDP has a strong showing here.
Well, and I'll leave it with you, Jason, but that did leave me to wonder, you know, I know that they made a big deal about how Jack Layton didn't run in a by-election and get into the House, but I agree with Andrew. I don't see Jagmeet Singh really anywhere, and I wonder at some point whether that's damaging him and whether the by-election might be a sign of that.
I was just thinking that we haven't heard much from him. He can go tour around, but he doesn't have the same gravitas if we're not going to see him in question period. I mean, question period was where Tom Mulcair certainly raised his profile.
That's right. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. See you next week.